Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. In today's video, I am going to bust 5 common myths about Christmas. Myth number 1 is that Jesus was born on December 25th. We don't really know what time of year Jesus was born. He could have been born in the winter, spring, summer, fall. We really don't know. What we do know is that when the Roman Empire became Christian, they took one of their winter solstice holidays and transformed it into a celebration of the birth of Jesus, which is why we still have it toward the end of December, but we really don't know what time of year Jesus was born. Myth number 2 is that there were 3 wise men, when the text never specifies exactly how many there were. There could have been 2, there could have been 200. We don't know how many wise men there were. We usually assume that there were 3 because there are 3 gifts that are mentioned, and so we sort of assign a wise man to each gift. But again, the text never says how many there were. Personally, I think there were more than 3 because when they were traveling such a great distance, they would probably have been part of a larger caravan to carry more supplies and just to stay safer on the road as they traveled to Bethlehem. But we really don't know exactly how many wise men there were. Myth number 3 is that Jesus was still an infant when the wise men arrived. In most of our nativity scenes, the wise men are there in the manger at the birth of Jesus or shortly after. But that's not at all what Scripture says. For one thing, Scripture says that the wise men saw his star when it rose in the east to signify his birth, and then they started traveling. So from the time it took them to start traveling to the time they arrived in Bethlehem, Jesus did some growing up. We also know from the text that when they arrived, they came to the house where the child was. It doesn't mention a manger, and it doesn't use the word for infant, just the word for a young child. And finally, we know that Herod sent soldiers to kill all of the boys in Bethlehem that were 2 years old and younger. And the reason is because based on the timeline that the wise men gave to King Herod, Jesus could have been somewhere around 1.5 to 2 years old. And so Herod wanted to cover that whole range to make sure that he got rid of him. So when the wise men arrived, Jesus was not still an infant. He was somewhere probably between 1 and 2 years old. Myth number 4 is that Jesus was born the night Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem. Right? The way we often hear the story is that Mary and Joseph traveled to Bethlehem and then they sort of have this emergency birth on the night they arrive. But there's nothing in the text to indicate that things happened that quickly. In fact, what the text does say is that while they were there, the time came for the child to be born. That sounds a lot like they arrived in Bethlehem, had some time to settle in, and then while they were there, then the time came for Jesus to be born. It wasn't like they arrived and then Jesus was born the same night. They arrived, they had time to find a place to stay, and then Jesus was born. And that brings us to perhaps the greatest myth of all, myth number 5, that Jesus was born in a stable outside. Jesus was almost certainly not born in a stable, but inside the house of one of Joseph's relatives. So let's walk through the story and see how we can tell that it was probably a house and not some kind of an outdoor stable. And by the way, I learned most of what I'm about to share from the late Dr. Ken Bailey, who was a Presbyterian minister and a missionary in the Middle East for many, many years, and he was an expert in the scriptures and in Middle Eastern culture. And I put some links in the description below where you can find his materials on this subject. Well, first, we've already seen that the text says, while they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. So again, they probably had time to find a place to stay, and they were probably not staying outside in a stable during that time. We also know that the reason they were there was because of the Roman census, which means that Mary and Joseph were not the only ones traveling to Bethlehem to be registered. There would have been loads of people coming back into the town to stay with relatives and family and friends, so every house would have been crammed full of distant relatives who had come for the census. And that explains one of the biggest misunderstandings and mistranslations, really, about the story of Jesus' birth. And that is that there was no room in the inn. First of all, the Greek word that is used there is not the word for an inn or a hotel. It's the word for the upper room in a private family home. And both of those Greek words, the word for inn and the word for upper room, are actually used later in the same gospel, and there they are translated correctly in our English versions. The first is in the story of the Good Samaritan, when the Samaritan rescues the wounded man and drops him off at an inn, at a hotel, and that does use the Greek word for inn, and it's translated correctly in our English versions. And then later in the gospel, when the disciples are having their Last Supper, they have it in the upper room, and the Greek word there is the same one that's used in the Christmas story about there being not enough room for Mary and Joseph and the baby, and it should be translated upper room in both places. But in many of our English versions, in the birth story, it's translated as inn incorrectly. So when it says there was no room in the inn, what it's actually saying is there was no room in the upper room of the house, which is where guests would have stayed, and the reason it was full was because of the census. So Mary and Joseph had room to stay in a house, but there wasn't quite room for them to have a baby and have a good place for the baby in the upper room of that same house. But what about the manger, right? It says Jesus was laid in a manger. Doesn't that indicate an outdoor stable? Well, not really, because archaeology has proven that many private homes in ancient Palestine and in Bethlehem had an entry level where there was a manger inside the house. As you walked inside the door, you were at the ground level, and there were some feeding troughs, a manger, for the animals that you wanted to keep inside, either to keep them warm or to keep them safe from predators. But that's where the animals would stay at night, and there was a manger for them to eat out of. Then there were a few small steps, and there was a raised floor throughout the rest of the house where the family would eat and live their life. And then some of those homes, if they were bigger, would have also had a second story or an upper room where guests could stay. So Jesus could still have been laid in the manger inside the house. And that actually makes a lot more sense because, again, this was Joseph's hometown. He had relatives there. And it's almost unthinkable that any of his family members would have allowed for Mary to give birth outside in a stable when they at least could have put him in a manger inside the house. That's the very least amount of hospitality that they could have shown in a region that was and still is known for its extraordinary hospitality. So Jesus was born in a manger, but it was probably inside the house. All right, so those are 5 busted myths about Christmas. Now that doesn't mean you have to go throw away all of your nativity sets. I love nativity sets. My wife and I collect them, even if they're not historically accurate. But I do hope that you will read the Christmas story with fresh eyes this year and gain an even deeper appreciation for all that God has done for us. Peace.